I think most horror games depend on you being weak. You aren't supposed to be able to reliably fight back, because anything that you can consistently fight off isn't exactly threatening enough for you to fear. The baseline of horror is built around your character's inability to effectively resist, because this inability is what generates fear in the first place. If any horror villain could be fended off just by giving them a firm slap, you would probably ask for your money back. Players need to have this constant anxiety, this understanding of the risk of fighting back, so to speak, because if they ever got the sense that they actually stand a chance at whatever's being thrown at them, then it would very quickly go from players running from horrors to players being the horrors. This makes enough sense, but a problem arises when games try to mix horror and multiplayer because it's difficult to keep the horror elements intact since individuals alone and individuals in groups have fundamentally different reactions. The first reason for this change in dynamic is the concept of strength in numbers because, as you've probably heard before, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Players might be weak individually, but the group is stronger, and that's a problem because it breaks the barrier between horror and action. Just like how a boss fight is easier if a lot of people are all fighting at once, a horror game is a lot less horrifying if a group of people are expected to be terrified by something that's really only a threat to each of them individually. There's also the issue of attention. When players are alone, it's a lot easier for them to feel the fear because their attention is on the horror. For example, walking home by yourself at night is unsettling since the details that you focus on keep you aware of any danger, which can get your fight or flight response to start acting up. On the other hand, this task becomes a lot more mundane when you start blasting I Wonder in your earbuds because then your attention is diverted more towards the music than it is at the possibility of getting shot up. It's a similar concept when it comes to multiplayer because players have their attention diverted away from horror elements by the people they're playing with, especially if people are playing with their friends since most of the feel of multiplayer is playing with your friends anyways. To sum things up, the issue with multiplayer is that it makes players less vulnerable or responsive to horror because it can disrupt how they react to it. With this being said, it would seem like I'm trying to say that multiplayer and horror aren't compatible. Well, I'd assume you know by now that this is not the case since you've probably read the title. Lethal Company in particular is an exceptional example of not only how horror and multiplayer can be worked into the same game, but also how they can be used to enhance each other. A lot of these problems actually just stem from the fact that multiplayer games usually involve subjecting players to the same things as a group. If the root cause is related to players being in groups, then it can be solved by splitting them up. If successful, you don't just get the player to pay attention to the horror and make them weak again, you can also use the fact that they've suddenly gone back to a state of weakness to make the horror more potent. It's like eating a rich and salty main course for dinner before having dessert served. The difference is what enhances the flavor. To put it shortly, if a game can isolate its players, then it can have all the fun of multiplayer while retaining the ability to be horrifying, even using multiplayer to enhance the horror. We'll be going over how Lethal Company executes isolation, what it does to players, and why isolation is important in certain scenarios. The video will be divided into two main halves. The first half will be about Lethal Company's iconic factories and mansions, which we'll call the interior or the facility, and the latter half will be about the outside ship and the ship once it's landed. There will also be timestamps for related subjects that will make up smaller parts as well. It's difficult to talk about the elements of Lethal Company linearly because every playthrough is different and the interiors are literally randomly generated, so we'll be going over everything Lethal Company does in the format of standard events that happen in every playthrough and events that are likely to occur in every playthrough. Finally, before we start, I'd just like to take a moment and thank everybody for all the support so far. Unfortunately, my editor is making me ask you to subscribe because apparently only 1 out of 220 people are actually subscribed anyways. It's free, it helps the channel, and it motivates me to actually upload, so if you do consider subscribing, I'd really appreciate it. Anyways, let's get on with it, shall we? There are two opening cutscenes, one made for version 50 and one for the latest update. They are set in different environments, but they both center around the same plot point. In the precursor, you find yourself in an office inside what appears to be a huge building. The room is completely dependent on artificial light, and outside of your window, a guard entity is stationed. Then all of a sudden, a loud explosion shakes the room and the power starts to fail. An impossible door opens to an impossible figure, a silhouette standing between you and a blinding light. Things go black. In the new opening cutscene, you find yourself floating through space, oxygen low but still alive. You gaze out at the stars as a piano sings your eulogy, but before you suffocate to death, you're strangely able to walk. The result? That same door opens before you again. The game begins when you slowly lift your eyes open, drowsy and dazed. As your vision clears and you pull yourself off of the ground, you only have a brief moment to gather your thoughts before a synthetic chime rings from a pair of old speakers. It's a pre-programmed message, and shortly after it greets you, it spews out a stream of distorted audio that is quickly skipped over.
Welcome to your first day on the job. This is your very own autopilot ship, where you will eat and sleep for the duration of your contract. Make yourself at home. To complete the onboarding process, you will want to check the instruction manual and sign into your ship's computer terminal. We trust you will be a great asset to the company.
After wishing you success in your new job and hoping that you'll become a great asset to the company, a song begins to play in the background and the voice malfunctions, devolving into a part of the chorus. What's important is that afterwards, it tells you to pick up a certain service manual for further instruction, and it tells you to look at your ship's terminal. In the beginning of the game, it's pretty hard to feel alone because of the fact that you're forced into a close proximity with others. This doesn't just lower your guard, it also makes you start to get used to being around a group of people, because in order for isolation to have the most effect on reintroducing horror, a status quo needs to be established in order to be broken later. During the intro, I said that players need to be weak in order to effectively horrify them because of how they need to be intimidated into actually running. Knowing this, it can seem kind of counterintuitive to have your players start off the game in a group since it puts them in a better position to fight, but remember, it's all about creating expectations and then subverting them. In this case, the game is giving players a false sense of confidence. Most players that start out solo will already be on guard for most of the game because it's advantageous for them to be ready 24/7. Since they have to rely on themselves, they'll weigh their options and decide to either fight whatever's in front of them or run away depending on the risk of each encounter. What this means is that even though the experience is more terrifying for them in the beginning, they'll usually be more prepared for what the game has in store later on. For players that start out in groups, this isn't the case because they know that there are other players watching their back, so it gives them the feeling that they can relax a little. This gives them a sort of Achilles heel, because it can feel like the horror is pushed to the side when players are in groups, and as we'll go in depth about later, they'll have a harder time staying together as the game progresses. When players do eventually become separated, the change in dynamic is significant enough for them to be discouraged from wanting to face any horrors the game serves alone, resulting in more fear once they do get separated. It's the same reasoning behind why many of you would be willing to do things that you wouldn't want to do alone if your friends were willing to join in. On your own, things can seem pretty daunting, but with a helping hand, it's not as bad. In this case, it's why getting players used to being in a group from the get-go makes a difference in the long run. When you look at it from this perspective, you can see how Lethal Company is actually really good at getting players used to being in groups. When you start out in the ship, there's actually way less space than there's supposed to be. Even if you and your friends squeezed up against the corners, there's still not enough distance to get them out of your peripheral vision. On top of this, Lethal Company's proximity chat, which becomes more important later, is also basically indistinguishable from a normal call because of the ship's size. So while you're busy chatting with your friends before the leader of the friend group starts the game, you can pretty quickly forget how unreliable communications are because they all depend on range. Even the chat doesn't work if you're too far away from each other. Along with the ship's small confines, its color palette and overall design heavily contrasts the bright orange hazmat suits of the players with something darker and more subtle. The interior is lit by fluorescent bulbs that cast intense rays of light bent into cones by brittle loops of gray steel. These overhead lights have a limited range, performing exceptionally well when standing right under them. In fact, they perform so well that holding sheets of paper within their reach can make them glow almost blindingly white. These powerful lights illuminate the small room that's composed almost exclusively out of monotone gray stainless steel, with shadows creeping around the edges of the few furnishings that are afforded to you by your employers. An empty red locker sits patiently against the wall at the end nearest to the door. Across from it is a coat rack with a single spare suit affixed to it with the help of a hanger. Posters are plastered on the wall as extra decoration, but it's difficult to notice unless you're directly looking at them. Back at the front of the ship, computers and monitors line the wall, and a small quadruple bunk bed is even included. The ship's design is easy to overlook, but I think it's worth mentioning since small details that add up are what make a good product anyways. However, I think its most important role is how it accentuates the neon orange suits of the employees and how it makes them stand out significantly from the darker and grittier surroundings. Because of this effect, players have their attention diverted to each other, which helps them ease into the group mentality. Besides the physical elements, what's also interesting is how in the early game, there's basically no direct intervention that tries to get you to do anything. Like, they don't even make you read the instructions, you can just wander around and spam buttons until something happens. Even the mechanical voice will be gone until the quota is due. Until then, your friends are your only company. This is also important because this allows players to get used to their situation with as little interference as possible, delaying the arrival of the moment in which they remember what genre of game they're playing. My point here is that even though there are instructions from the game, they aren't disruptive. If there were flashy objectives, the player would be too distracted to actually be bothered by anything anyways. For example, let's say that you're beginning to be immersed in a game, or maybe even a roughly hour-long video essay, and then all of a sudden, a blue box flashes onto the screen saying, "Stab 20 people for 1000 Battle Pass experience." Even if it doesn't completely ruin the game, notifications like these are still enough to break the immersion, even if it's just a little bit. What makes maintaining immersion important for Lethal Company in particular is that the game also needs to keep the focus of not just one player, but the focus of every player. This is because if even one person decides to change the subject, it can throw everything off balance because it circles back to how players interpret their situation. For Lethal Company, it might not be as extreme as an entire TF2 lobby deciding not to play the game since there are time constraints, but there's always that one guy who sees a horrifying monster and then says, "I'm gonna give it a kiss." If you heard one of your coworkers utter those words, it would probably make you laugh because they're seeing the game's presented situation as just a game and not really something that you should be terrified by. In this case, the game isn't immersive enough for one person to even try to act as intended, so they derail the entire thing for everybody else. There are also several other things that Lethal Company introduces in the early game in order to have enough room for isolation to take effect later on. It has a simple GUI, it gives you access to a service manual, and most importantly, it gives you enough time to interact with your teammates. Starting with the GUI, the controls and mechanics of Lethal Company are pretty basic, but that's good because it means that players can pick them up without having to spend much time worrying about some complicated input pattern. These mechanics serve important roles in building isolation among individual players because of how it affects their behaviors and their proximities to one another. The most important part of the GUI is probably the inventory system. For the entire game, the maximum number of items that you can hold is 4, no more and no less. Well actually, I took so damn long that there's a new tool bag, but tools aren't really what you're focusing on in terms of inventory space, so everything I'm about to say is still true, especially because using the tool bag still takes a quarter of your inventory space. This would be a particularly harsh limitation if you were playing alone, but as long as you have other people with you, your group can carry way more in total because all of those small bits add up. This limited inventory system forces more player interaction because players will naturally want to carry different things. Some might want to bring weapons or first aid in case of an emergency, while some players will want to have their slots open so they can move faster and collect more. These differing mindsets can result in interesting outcomes. For example, it's not entirely true that players who aren't holding items can't use them. They just need to stand next to the person who is actually carrying them. So with this logic, players can often clump up with one person holding tools and another basically acting like U-Haul. At first, this might seem like it's actually doing the opposite of isolating players, but they can really only behave to afford like this when the amount of scrap that their employers expect them to bring back is reasonably low. As the game progresses, this type of behavior is a lot harder to maintain, but the reason why it matters now is because once again, it's setting up the norm early on so that players will be more affected by isolation when it really matters. The movement system in Lethal Company is also pretty simple, but it's still effective in isolating people because of how it leads to varying movements. Your options are normal walking, crouching for stealth, climbing ladders, sprinting in dark situations, and jumping to crossover gaps. Of course, it wouldn't really make sense if you could run without restraint at full speed in a horror game, so the more intensive actions like sprinting and jumping cost stamina. At the top left of your screen, there's an orange bar that records how much stamina you have left. Each jump will slice a chunk off, while sprinting will slowly drain it. If you expend all your stamina, then there's a delay in recovery time. This is all good and well, but now's a good time to mention that this system is particularly brutal because it doesn't just prevent you from running a lot, it also prevents you from jumping a lot, and when we get to looking at the interior design of your workplace, you'll probably be able to understand why taxing jumping is so harsh. When players are faced with limitations like this one, they will naturally adopt different types of playstyles to adjust to them. Some people might choose to use their stamina sparingly, conserving it in case a moment arises in which they need to other reserves full, while others who are more impatient run into situations at full speed. There are many factors that can determine how someone might choose to move, with only a few of these, for example, being spatial awareness and familiarity with the environment. My point is that these subtle differences in each player's movement will ultimately affect the various speeds they move at, meaning that some people will get to certain destinations faster while other players catch up. This is an important step in building an atmosphere of isolation because those small differences add up over time and can quickly result in spreading players out more. You might also have noticed the scale underneath the orange stamina bar, and it also has a purpose in affecting player movement, but we'll save that for later because weight is only worth mentioning if you're actually holding something. Instead, let's move on to the manual. The way Lethal Company's mechanics contribute to the game's aspect of isolation is primarily physical, but the purpose of the manual is different because what it does is less direct. Besides being a great way to segue into other topics, the manual affects players by leaving them kind of uninformed. Not because it's poorly written, although it can be intentionally vague at times, but because all the information that it presents forces players to actually sit down and read. It makes them more likely to try and find answers elsewhere, including asking each other questions. When you first pick it up, you can already tell from just a quick glance that it isn't exactly what you would expect from a guide whose objective is to make sure that you're absolutely sure on what to do. That would ruin the point of not having a tutorial to begin with. Instead, the manual basically only offers general instructions and broad information while still being written like an actual manual. While reading the manual isn't necessarily hard, a lot of players probably choose to just skim through it even if they decide to pick it up and then ask their friends about what to do before giving up and opening the wiki. Unless you and the people that you play the game with start at basically the same time, you're most likely going to have different amounts of knowledge that you can piece together. I can confidently say that if others are available for questioning, people will resort to asking first before putting in the effort to find answers for themselves. Why is this? Probably because most people are lazy and want instant gratification, and asking people around you for answers requires a lot less effort than going through the process of searching through sources. When you think about it, it's kind of funny how we can literally search up almost anything at basically any time, but we'll still often choose to ask the people around us. Under that logic, the fact that reading the manual is slightly less convenient than asking other people on how to do stuff makes it more likely for players to ask each other whenever confusion arises. If someone does decide to read the manual, then they'll probably be talking to their friends the whole time anyways, because there's only one manual and the reader might try being helpful. Because people are lazy, even if they decide to look at the wiki as a last resort, only one person will probably volunteer that responsibility to themselves and then share their findings with everyone else. Just like how small variations in movement can add up to spread people out, small increases in reliance on others can make them more used to having others as a resource, so when they end up getting isolated, the effects of isolation are stronger. Anyways, let's take a look inside the manual because its contents bring up game elements that also add on to Lethal Company's isolation effect that we'll need to know for later. The first section is about the scanner, a tool that you'll be using a lot. It's basically a metal detector, but instead of metal, it detects anything that isn't part of the environment. The reason why you've been equipped with it though is because of its ability to detect treasure. For example, something like this 20th century masterpiece by a forgotten artist that depicts a vibrant forest or a literal solid bar of gold. If you're lucky, it might even pick up on a pair of old dentures. Interestingly enough, it can also detect biomass, not things that are necessarily alive, but biomass. When the scanner does detect biomass, it'll ping the research team back at the company and they'll send you information on the thing you've just scanned. If they told you what you were going to be coming across before you actually came across it, then that would ruin the suspense and would make players more individually prepared to deal with them, which doesn't really help the game, so hiding the cards that are in play enriches the game by controlling information. Continuing to look through the pages will bring you to a section about your ship's autopilot and the terminal's commands. We'll save that for later because a lot of interesting things that you can do with it require you to be out of orbit. Plus, I want to focus on the manual for now. What matters right now is a section about a quota that I mentioned earlier, and it's the demand that you're contractually obligated to fulfill. According to the contract, employees have 3 days to collect salvageable material at an increasing volume each cycle. Once they do, they'll have to sell a certain amount of their inventory to the company in order to fill a quota, and as you continue working, the quota will increase, growing faster than GameStop stock did back in 2021. The quota is measured in company credits, and every time you sell scrap of any sort to the company, you get a payout depending on how much the scrap you turned in was worth. The price of any one material can fluctuate from a day-to-day basis, but it's usually the highest on the last day. On a surface level, the quota's purpose is to take the role of an overarching task that players try to fulfill. And to be fair, that's actually exactly what it is, but it's also important in a different way because of how it affects players due to its difficulty scaling. As the days pass, the quota can quickly increase, which forces players to go to more difficult moons, along with forcing them to stay out of orbit for longer. If they all tried to stick together, then most casual players probably wouldn't be able to gather enough scrap, and as a result, get. With the fear of unemployment in mind, they would naturally aim to avoid this ill fate, but would have different approaches. The main issue here is the degree to which players are willing to risk their lives in order to meet the quota. For example, some players will aim to bring back more scrap to the ship in the event that something unfortunate happens, while some players will choose to be more aggressive in their approach and scour the facility for longer. This is the same reason why some of your teammates can feel like dead weight, while another teammate can absolutely carry you. It's because people come up with different solutions to tackle this challenge. The players who seek to gather more scrap might actually be thinking in the long term, while the less risky players think in the short term as they're more concerned with buying themselves enough time to actually make it to the next quota. This duality in adopted methods is what results in further isolation between players because of disagreements in their respective solutions, not socially but literally causing them to interact less because of their playstyles. The main takeaway from the manual is that it lets other players take the center stage, giving room for interactions to take place. If you're confused on how to do something and you want to know how to do it right, having someone explain the process to you is usually a lot more convenient than having to figure it out yourself. In Lethal Company's case, these interactions are important because it's another way the game is able to solidify the distinction between parts of itself in which you are and aren't isolated. Setting up this difference is important because it's what makes isolating someone effective in the first place. Besides reading the manual, which we've gone over, and using the terminal, which we're saving for later, you can't really do much else while in orbit, so with that being said, let's land the ship. As the ship enters the atmosphere of Lethal Company's first moon, gray clouds wrap around it in an almost suffocating embrace. Continuing with the descent, a bleak monolithic structure appears in the distance as the clouds give way. The ship lands at a predetermined landing site located directly in front of the facility. You'll have to make your way back here with all the scrap you've collected, but that shouldn't be a major concern for now. The moon, named Experimentation, looks like it's been decimated. Orange-tinted beige sand fills the desert wasteland, all that remains of a world destroyed by pollution and the ever-turning cogwheels of war and industry. Rocks and dried vegetation are scattered across a sea of sand and dirt, as shrubs sway against the volatile breeze and locusts swirl around in a cacophony, clinging onto life against all odds. The sky isn't the friendly shade of blue that you would expect either. Instead, it's a swirling mixture of dust storms and residual smoke, blended into a translucent light brown concoction. The sun burns red in the sky as the skeletons of once lively trees stand defiantly against the roaring winds, an aging relic of a bygone era, one where experimentation was capable of sustaining more robust flora. As the aged red giant sheds its fragile light down upon the moon, the few thin rays of light that manage to pierce through the sky reveal the ocean of beige surrounding a menagerie of bland and grey industrial structures, with any paint they could have worn away by time. These remnants of civilization are mostly dilapidated. Scouting the area will show the remains of a once functioning industrial site. Directly in front of your ship's landing site, a massive stretch of railroad lines the perimeter of a titanic structure, your destination. A pile of broken rusting metal blocks one side of the rails that clearly haven't been used in ages. Past the railroad is where the monolithic structure rests, an extremely expansive, towering factory that looks like it stretches on forever standing before you. To the left, massive pipelines flow directly into the heart of the facility, funneling the few remaining fluids of the already dried out moon. Walking back to the factory, an abandoned church lies dormant in the background with its doors torn off. Whatever worshippers attended service have clearly all perished or fled, not leaving any traces of what it was that they prayed to. As you approach the factory, the cliffs seem to shrink as the building is much taller. At the center of the gargantuan structure is a rather small pair of doors. Upon entering, the sound of cool steel crashing together sounds behind you as you slam the doors shut. A ceiling fan, rapidly spinning, blocks out the light above it, creating a distinct pattern of shadows dancing on the welded sheets of grated metal that make up the floor. 3 doors lie in front of you. 2 of them are basically decoys. One of them could be blocked off, filled with brick and mortar, or lead to an ominous office room, devoid of any furnishings, or one of them could appear to be promising before ultimately leading you to a dead end. One of these 3 is the real deal. Although you've seen the giant stature of the factory building outside, it doesn't really give you a good idea of just how big the inside is because it's so tall that it's difficult to get a good view of just how far it goes back. Even when you're still in the sky, it's hard to appreciate the true size of the factory because of how far away you are from it. From the inside though, the scale of the interior can truly be understood. The door that leads to the deepest depths of the factory is simply the starting point in which an ever-expanding tree of rooms and corridors branch out. You usually don't need to look very far before coming across your first piece of scrap though, as upon entering and using your scanner, there will often be scrap located in the first few rooms. When you pick up the object, it's surprisingly heavy, like a lot heavier than it looks. According to your scale, even a small object like this one is
19 pounds.
Abnormally heavier than it would be on a planet like Earth, and as you grab it and continue moving, you're noticeably slower. This brings us to the weight system. Hopefully you can imagine that carrying 400 pounds of scrap metal with you and then trying to get back to your ship isn't going to work out very well because the more stuff you try to drag out with you, the slower you actually go. Oh, and to add the cherry on top, the more valuable scrap is actually a lot heavier too, and when you pick it up, it'll prevent you from picking up or using any other items until you put it down. Earlier, we discussed movement and how it's used to separate people. Well, the way weight works also adds on to this because of how it slows people down differently. Lethal Company is a game that's fundamentally about picking up items and making it out alive with as much as you can carry, and when you've already been constrained by the fact that you can only hold 4 items, you're going to want to try and keep yourself from carrying too much because it could seriously impair your ability to move. To account for this, something that most players will do is drop items off outside of the entrance so that they can free up inventory space. In the process, you leave the factory while everyone else remains inside, and when this happens, it becomes a lot easier to lose track of where your teammates are. At first the impact is small, but as you clear out the sections in the front, you'll have to take increasingly complex routes to travel deeper into the factory. This, coupled with the fact that each person will decide to drop off items depending on their own conditions, is what makes this significant. The point at which you all begin to start searching for scrap is also the point at which you'll begin to be separated from your friends because of all the things that we've been talking about. These factors and their respective effects result in a slow but steady separation. First, people will usually break off into smaller groups since it's a waste of manpower to all be in the same area. Then as time passes, staying in cohesive units also becomes more challenging. Once you reach a certain limit, I feel like the various situations converge into 2 scenarios. You can either escape safely, or you can stay inside the factory, now alone. Ironically, we'll focus more on the first scenario in the latter half of this video, so for now, let's focus on an example of scenario number 2. Even if you're still able to remain in pairs, it doesn't change the fact that the actual group itself has already been split up. Granted, having even one person with you is still better than being alone, but being in groups sort of has this mirroring effect because each person gains confidence from every other person present. Compared to a group of 3 or 4, being in pairs isn't going to make you as mentally resistant to the terror. For now though, let's just consider a scenario in which you're actually alone because 1, it's easier to write, and 2, we don't have all day. Wandering alone is a unique experience. A few moments ago, your attention was being taken up by people that were able to ground you in reality, but now your surroundings become more vivid as you slowly tune into its ambience. The factory is a place of winding cavernous hallways and twisting junctions that lead to a grid of endless mazes and a cacophony of dilapidated rooms. There are no windows. That'd be pointless as the factory is so big that any sunlight wouldn't be able to make it past the first set of rooms anyways. This lack of natural light results in a dependency on artificial lights, and because of this, you can't really tell the time. The ship will leave once things become too dangerous at around midnight, and your teammates will make the choice to leave far before that opportunity arises, so you'll need to rely on your mental timer in order to pace yourself. Your friends can also start the ship if they've already died, so they might all be watching you, and if they decide that you're a lost cause, they'll leave without you. Finding your way out is definitely possible, but that depends on how far gone you already are. The longer that you stay inside the factory, the harder navigating to the exit is. This adds another level of stress because if you get lost, you're basically doomed since you have no one to lead you out now that you're all alone. In these moments of isolation, that's when the game makes its move. There are a variety of things that can be thrown at you, and to be fair, it could be something relatively non-threatening, like an amorphous blob or this bug that can be easily avoided by just backing off. This time, it's a giant fucking spider. The bunker spider usually isn't that big of a deal unless you manage to get its attention. When that happens, it'll wake up and begin to chase after you almost relentlessly. Even then, it's not that threatening if you play your cards right. The problem is that once you've become isolated, you aren't in the right headspace to calmly make your exit. All that patient waiting has come to fruition and the terror fully sets in. I know for a fact that at least 96.4% of you aren't Australians, so you'd probably be panicking like crazy coming across one of these on your own for the first time. The only thing that you can do now is run, because it's far too dangerous to fight without any proper weapons, let alone by yourself. You can't run forever though. Unless you're already close to the exit or really good at spatial recognition, it's probably over for you. It might not even be the spider that gets you. You could accidentally run into a mine or a turret or accidentally misstep and plummet to your death. Regardless, it's moments like these that show Lethal Company's excellence in horror multiplayer. Once you die, there's this strange sense of relief because the isolation ends since you can now talk directly to your friends who have also died somehow. As the ship flies away, you're given time to mentally recover from what just happened. There are a lot of different variables that can determine how you respond to being chased down by whatever paralysis demons lurk around in the factory, but all these variables tie back into isolation and where your attention is. I think the easiest way to present this is to talk about the atmosphere of the game under isolation, and specifically about the mood it conveys and how it affects your perceptions. Before we move on to this next section, let's briefly review because admittedly this is a pretty long video. Lethal Company is really good at hiding its horror setting behind multiplayer elements like proximity chat and funny moments, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself as to not lose any quality in the process. In doing so, it's able to preserve its horror elements using isolation as the catalyst to remind players of what genre of game they're playing. Let's start by talking about how isolation changes perceptions, specifically how it changes how you perceive threats in your environment, because in a situation in which you're isolated, how you interpret your senses can act as the force that peels back the charm and humor to let the horror elements shine through. We went into a lot of detail earlier, talking about how players can sort of have their focus taken away from the game by other players. They can usually divert attention away from elements that are vital to the horror experience, like their surroundings. This is an issue because a lot of the terror actually comes from the environment itself because of how it's always supposed to keep you on your toes. For example, most of us can agree that walking up the stairs when you've just turned off all the lights is actually pretty terrifying. However, if you were doom scrolling while crawling up the stairs to your bedroom like I'd be doing, you probably wouldn't be all that bothered since you'd be too distracted to notice the environment that you're in. It's a similar concept when you've just started playing in Lethal Company because in the beginning, you're too distracted by your friends for its dark and gritty atmosphere to take full effect. It's always going to be unsettling in a dark factory, but it's a lot less nerve-wracking navigating through it in a group than by yourself. That changes once you become isolated, so let's talk about how isolation is able to bring the terror back to the table, as in the absence of distractions, you're able to see things as they're meant to be. Even on experimentation, the first moon that you land on, you immediately have your sight hindered by fog, and depending on the different weather conditions, visibility can be even lower. The path to the factory is literally straight ahead of you, but it's still slightly disorienting because of how it cuts off the information you have access to. Inside the factory, your vision is even more hindered. Immediately after entering, the translucent fog that had only impaired your vision is replaced by a viscous darkness that makes it way harder to see, probably due to the fact that spiders don't know how to change light bulbs. On top of this, electrical malfunctions and faulty pipes can lead to a complete blackout. This is all pretty standard stuff for horror games, but why this matters in Lethal Company is the fact that having other people with you actually mitigates this problem because there are more people scanning the surroundings, which means that players in groups will generally be able to keep track of a larger area. This makes the situation less concerning because if anything goes wrong, you know that you'll at least be warned about it. When players become isolated, they lose the comfort of having other people watch their backs, which makes their environment more unsettling because they have to switch gears to being alone, and simply because of the fact that having to constantly watch corners can drive a man insane. With that being said, let's actually look at the factory. Inside, the walls fold up around you and the enormous building has its space divided into hundreds, if not thousands, of rooms and corridors. Because of these sectioned off rooms and the preceding dark environment, it's difficult to determine what's in the room ahead of you without going in at first. That's not even considering the, how should I put it, specialized room, like these intricate mazes and large open spaces. Their original purposes are now lost to time, but the hallways that branch out and curve to connect you to these rooms result in many corners and choke points that also obscure your peripheral vision. All of these corners are enough to make any Valorant player spend $100 on one gun skin hoping that it'll be a good luck charm and make them stop losing every comp game, but in Lethal Company it means forcing the player to proceed carefully so they don't accidentally run headfirst into the loving arms of a sentry and proceed to eat lead. The interior design with all of these obstructions also blocks the scanner, which makes things even worse for the player because now they know even less about their surroundings. When you have other people with you, you can mitigate this problem because you can have other people look around for you, but when you're alone, that's not an option. In this sense, isolation takes away not only your strength in numbers, but it also hinders your ability to process your situation and can make you act rashly. It's like how there are a lot of YouTube videos that detail how you can survive any different horror movies like A Quiet Place or It, but in the heat of the moment, that's not feasible, especially when you don't know what you're working with. In fact, there's actually something in the game that preys on your inability to see. The Bracken is a stalker. It lurks around in the dark and has a random chance of appearing, choosing you as its target. We'll go over it and other entities more in depth later, but it basically waits around until you have your guard down before rushing at you and dragging you back to its den, where it'll probably skin and eat you. The only reliable way to get it to screw off is by looking at it for a few seconds and then turning away to sort of give it a warning glance, because apparently it's an introvert. If you don't catch it in time though, it can spontaneously rush towards you and then, proceed to skin and eat you alive. The thing is, if you had teammates watching your back, then it would be a lot easier to deal with because you would have more eyes watching more area. Now don't get me wrong, running into a Bracken is no walk in the park even if you have other people with you. However, I think isolation is what really makes these situations go from unsettling to terrifying because of the difference in how you choose to manage situations like these once you become isolated. Since dealing with a Bracken is more challenging alone than with other people, the alternative option of running for your life suddenly seems a lot more appealing, and that results in more terror because resolving yourself to run instead of fight is a sign that whatever is on your hands is a situation that you aren't comfortable with facing head on. It ties back into the concept of fight or flight, which we'll review shortly, but for now, just think of it in the same vein as playing a 5v5 tac shooter where you have all your teammates alive versus when you have to clutch the round. The situation is a lot more intense in the latter, and what that means for Lethal Company is more fear. There's also another idea that I want to throw around before we move on. Earlier, I mentioned how being isolated makes your surroundings more vivid, which is kind of contradictory because I just spent 4 pages describing how your vision is hindered, but let me explain. It hinders your visibility relative to your overall area. It's not easy to see down long dark hallways because of how unreliable the lights are, but what the weak lighting does is accentuate the visuals of what you can see. Think about it like this: if you got up at night and there was some faint moonlight that slipped through your window, you could probably make out basic shapes, but you wouldn't be able to see in fine detail. In low lighting, you can also see a silhouette and think to yourself, oh, there's a demon that's about to eat me, when in reality, it's just a pile of clothes. In this sense, your immediate vicinity is more vivid not just because it's easy to see, but because you're forced to pay more attention to it, sort of like scoping in on a target. This is relevant to us because paying more attention to your surroundings is only possible if you have any attention left to give. When you're surrounded by a bunch of smiling friends, that's not really an option because you can overlook a lot when you're preoccupied listening to someone explain to you what type of food a banana is. A lot of the terror that you can experience does come from the game's atmosphere, so if you pay more attention to it, the more terror that you can actually get out of it. In single-player games, this isn't really a concern because of how there's nothing to pay attention to but the environment, but as we've already discussed, players can pretty quickly distract each other. Lethal Company isolating individual players helps shift the focus back onto the game's environment, and this helps keep the game horrifying. So let's move on to the other parts of perceiving environments, and when I mean parts, I really only mean hearing, because it's a video game and you can't smell, taste, or touch anything on screen. I think the first thing that we should start off with is communication, because a lack of communication is at the core of isolation. For example, here's a quick flashback to the dark ages of 2020, which was 4 years ago by the way. If you were in VC with your friends playing Hypixel Skyblock or even just watching a streamer for 18 hours straight, you probably wouldn't feel isolated because you would have been busy talking to them. Not only did doing things with other people leave your mind too preoccupied for dark thoughts to creep in, it also took up your attention. Isolation is something that frees up headspace, and it leaves enough room for you to start overanalyzing things. In a horror game, that usually means letting more terror seep in. Now, you might be thinking, if someone is playing a horror game, they won't have any headspace because playing the game is what's keeping them preoccupied. And to that I'd first say, thank you for actually listening to me while you're playing Minecraft in the background or something. And then I'd ask, if someone is in a dangerous situation, let's say, I don't know, constantly being at risk of getting chased down by one of these things, what's going to be on their mind as they're navigating around? My guess is that they would first be thinking about how much they hate their job, not getting their neck snapped because of a slight error. If the said someone was constantly talking to their friend about something else, I can pretty confidently say that, as a result, they'd have less focus on how much they hate their employers just because they're splitting their attention. If you isolate someone by cutting off communications, they go back to being more worried about their safety, and as a result, experience more terror. Also, the importance of Lethal Company starting players out in groups can be seen at around the same time when communication gets cut off, because through the act of starting players out together, it sets a precedent that being in a group is normal. When communications get cut off and players start getting isolated, they'll naturally start thinking about the regrouping, which makes isolation more effective and therefore enhances the horror of the game. A major part of the conflict between multiplayer and horror is the fact that communications can easily get in the way of someone letting themselves soak in all the horror. I mentioned this before, but to solve this, Lethal Company's communication comes in the form of proximity chat, and it's recommended for a reason that you play like this instead of doing the cowardly thing and staying in a call on Discord. It doesn't just restrict communication in order to isolate players, it actually enhances it because as distance increases, your ability to communicate is literally cut off in real time so that you aren't too distracted by excessive comms. This isn't the last time that sound communication will come up, so for now, let's wrap up this section about senses and perceptions. Ultimately, how you perceive your environment is what determines the level of caution you navigate it with. Earlier, I mentioned fight or flight, but I didn't elaborate on it because there wasn't enough to work with, but now that we've gone over everything, we can end this section by revisiting it. The fight or flight response is a mechanism designed to get you to either run like hell or fight like hell whenever you genuinely feel threatened. Fundamentally, this reaction is what the horror part of the game appeals to. When the game begins, you are not isolated, and when you get all the benefits of being in a group, your fight or flight response will probably not even be active or even geared towards the fight direction, because being in a group can make your surroundings seem a lot less threatening. Triggering this response is essential to the experience of most traditional works of horror because it's the sensation that people feel right after a strong sense of fear. In groups, they do feel fear, but the actual experience of individuals shifts away from horror because being in a group alters the follow-through. Lethal Company, though, is really good at isolating its players, and because they get isolated, they also have their perceptions changed. Like we literally just talked about, when people become isolated, it's easier for them to be affected by their environment since there are less distractions taking up their attention, which tackles the problem head on. So far, we've mostly been going over how isolation contributes to giving you a sense of terror or the feeling that you get when your parents are looking for your report card, but it's equally as important for horror or the feeling that you get when your parents actually find out what's on your report card. In Lethal Company's case, what delivers the horror happens to be these sorts of things. There are a lot of entities to talk about. For now, I want to keep it to the ones that are actually inside the factory because there are way more of them compared to outside entities. We'll go over the outside ones later. Anyways, the Coilhead. The Coilhead is a creature that isn't described as being alive. Instead, they're actually biological weapons of war. The Coilhead is basically SCP-173 or Weeping Angel. If you look at it, it can't move, but looking away for just a second will allow it to catch up to you. It sucks at opening doors apparently, but to make up for it, it's really fucking fast. Like, you could turn around for a second and it'd be right behind you. The problem with the Coilhead though is that it's really strong when picking players off one by one, but in groups, it's reduced to a questionable modern art piece. This is the issue of weakness that isolation tackles, because the Coilhead wouldn't be that terrifying if it could easily be defeated by the power of friendship. Of course, there are caveats and workarounds, but I think that the Coilhead is a good example of why isolation is important. I know I've been kind of glossing over it a little bit, but the Coilhead is actually really good at scaring players in the right situations because of how quickly it can appear and seal the show. The Coilhead is good at grabbing attention because of how it literally forces players to look at it, but it suffers when players are in groups because it's trivially easy to get one of these things out of your way with the help of another pair of eyes. If you have someone else with you, it basically goes from thinking that you need to carefully maneuver around to sort of like walking past someone that you sort of know but not well enough to acknowledge. In these instances, isolation preserves the horror because it means that there will be a higher chance that players will interact with Coilheads on their own. As promised, the second entity is the Bracken, since we're revisiting it from earlier. So the Bracken and the Coilhead are kind of similar in the sense that they both require players to focus on them. The difference is in how the Coilhead needs a constant line of sight, when the Bracken only needs brief eye contact, and it also depends on the distance that the players are affected by them. We've already talked about how isolation makes the Bracken more terrifying, so there's no need to repeat it, but what I really want to focus on right now is how the Bracken makes players want to regroup, since it's a common theme for every entity. For example, the snare flea latches onto your head and makes you flail around, hoping that you can find your teammates so that they can, get it off of your head. Enemies like the mass mimics will also pretend to be your teammate just to get close enough to kill you. For now, let me explain why I bring this up. The desire to regroup is something that actually intensifies feelings of isolation because it strengthens the contrast between what's perceived as a normal situation, aka the group that players start out in, and what's an abnormal situation, or players after they become separated. By making players want to regroup, the entities can actually capitalize on how players feel more vulnerable as an effective isolation. Think about it like this: you and your friends decide to go urban exploring, but you accidentally lose track of them. If you came across a trap or a murderer holding an axe at this point, you would know that you'd probably be screwed since you can't be sure if anyone could make it to where you are to help out. Knowing this and fearing that there's real danger in being separated, it would probably make you want to find your friends again because it would give you a better chance of avoiding any danger if you had other people to navigate with you. That's why everybody knows that splitting up and looking for clues will usually result in somebody getting taken out. This desire to regroup makes not being able to find other people more frustrating, and it makes the feeling of isolation stronger as a result. Even though you're trying to regroup, it still takes time, and that leads to anxiety, since each passing second is another opportunity that something unfortunate could happen when you're in a weaker state. Isolation can then make these encounters with entities like the Bracken more horrifying because it means that players are left in a vulnerable position when they actually encounter them. So now that we've gone over how entities are made more effective as horror elements by isolation, let's talk about the post-landing ship and how isolation not only affects the experience of players whenever they're inside whatever scrapyard they're currently raiding, but also how it enhances the terror that you can feel from each of the hostile environments of the moons. We're gonna start this section off with how the ship and the terminal's features contribute to isolation in the same vein as the structures of the various facilities do before we move on to the environments of the moons, and definitely not because it's just like a good segue or anything. At the front of the ship, mounted above the landing controls, are a set of monitors, with a few of them being connected to security cameras installed outside of the ship, since it doesn't have any windows. During orbit, the monitors are all filled with a light shade of green, with the monitor in the center displaying information about the moon that you're orbiting. Stationed next to the landing controls is a monstrously sized computer. Painted beige and reaching from the floor to the ceiling of the ship, the terminal towers above your average employee. Opposed to its abnormally large chassis is its small display, pitch black with the overhead lights glaring off of it. Affixed immediately below the screen is a series of red buttons and levers. Beside it, a mundane office keyboard wired directly into the terminal. The terminal works like a command console, only able to process text line commands. When you open it, green text sprawls across it as it awaits further input. For the screens in front, when you're in orbit, the one we care about shows info on the moon that you're orbiting with important details like the weather of the moon and the danger rating of the moon. Once you've landed, you can see the immediate area around your ship from the security monitors, and instead of displaying info, the central monitor instead becomes like a map that lets you track the position of each player. It also displays dangers and treasure in the vicinity of selected players, so it's extremely useful as a utility tool, except it's stuck on the ship. When it comes to the terminal, it basically does everything that you'd be able to do normally on a computer. It has the space version of Amazon on the same hour delivery, a bestiary, a navigation menu, and a storage management feature for all the furniture and stuffed animals that you decided to burn your money on. We'll go over the shop later. As previously mentioned though, the terminal has a pretty big caveat, and it's the fact that you have to stay on the ship because there are no outlets in the factory that you can plug this behemoth into. As you can imagine, the fact that these useful features are stuck on the ship means that anyone who wants to use them is also stuck on the ship. On missions, this means that they have to stay behind. I'm going to call this person Ship Guy from now on, and what the Ship Guy does by staying behind is volunteer themselves for isolation. Not only does this immediately isolate one person, it also means that there are going to be less people in the factory in total, which means that the people that are in the scary place are more likely going to be isolated as well, simply on account of the fact that there are less people that are actually looking around. It's like how every trio has an 89% chance of breaking down into a duo because the weakest link eventually gets cut off. So now let's talk about the shop, since it's one of the most important features the terminal gives you access to. It unlocks ship upgrades and it lets you buy equipment, with each of these items and upgrades having their own contributions to isolation. On top of that, upgrades can only be used when players are on the ship, so getting them makes staying on the ship seem more appealing because it makes players consider how valuable having someone on standby to use these features would be. The goal of these items is to make the game easier, but they actually kind of suck at what they do. I wouldn't say that they're completely useless, but more like side grades, sort of like how there are different TF2 weapons where each weapon has its own benefit and downside. For example, you can buy a stimulant called TZP Inhalant, which restores your stamina upon use, but it has a lot of adverse side effects, with one of these being making your screen red and blurry. Now, the reason I mention this isn't just because it follows the convention of how you're supposed to make your players weak so they're vulnerable, but also because some of the stuff that you can buy doesn't seem like it exactly helps with isolation, specifically the teleporter and the walkie-talkie. Let's start with the teleporter. It doesn't make a lot of sense to say that the teleporter is something that adds to the isolation factor of Lethal Company since it literally brings people together, but the argument isn't exactly that it's not good at isolating people, but the fact that it's bad at bringing people together. It's useful enough to warrant having, but it's unreliable. The teleporter only works for one person at a time, and it's difficult to tell what's actually happening to the person you want to teleport from purely the map. You can only estimate the severity of what's happening to the target that you're observing because the map is also unreliable. For example, you can tell if someone is being chased by an entity, but you can't immediately determine which one it is. Also, you can't zoom out either since the map only shows the area around each player. The thing is, unless you and your target each have a walkie-talkie, which we'll talk about later, you can really only assume what's happening to them, and this miscommunication can lead to errors. For example, you might accidentally teleport someone who was just doing something that they felt like they could have escaped from. You can't tell because the representations of each target of interest is purely symbolic, and that can lead to situations where another person will get annoyed because they might have lost all the hard-earned scrap that they wanted to bring back. I think the most extreme example is how possessed players have AI that make them act like they're real players. So they'll try to spin to get you to teleport them, and then they'll also try to pretend to check corners. These uncertainties can lead to mistakes in judgment, which then leads to hesitation. When you factor in how using the teleporter can absolutely destroy your quota by forcing someone to drop all their items, you would probably only want to use it if you were sure your friend was going to die or if you were just trying to recover a corpse. However, as mentioned before, a lot of the ship upgrades have both uses and drawbacks, and for the teleporter, the issue isn't usually the cooldown, it's the fact that the process of teleporting someone can take a few seconds. Oh, and before we move on, there's also a reverse teleporter, which teleports players to a random section of the factory. More than one person can go in at a time, but that just breaks players up quicker. Now let's talk about the walkie-talkie. It suffers from the same problem, being that it's also just kind of bad at what it does. It basically does what you would expect it to do, letting players talk to each other even if they're out of range for proximity chat to work. In an especially precarious situation where you have to work your way around hordes of monsters in a place that would probably give you cancer from all the asbestos in the air, having reassurance is a lot more important. But when you're working in stressful environments, you need to have a certain mindset, and you can't be yapping to someone when you're supposed to be focusing. Granted, most players will stick to asking for directions and relaying information, but instead of distracting them from the fact that they need to focus on the task at hand, they're distracted from the fact that they're still by themselves. The walkie-talkie forces the ship guy to basically only watch one person because in order to get the most use out of the walkie-talkie, they have to account for the fact that the map only shows the area around one person at a time. Since the whole point of the walkie-talkie is to help locate treasure, players inside can often veer off in seemingly random directions, as only people carrying the walkie-talkie can actually hear it. As a result, they can leave their other teammates behind, making it more likely for them to be isolated. If you've been paying attention, vulnerability is important in maintaining horror because players need to be geared towards running instead of fighting. That's why it's just as hilarious as logical as it is to make one of your most reliable weapons a fucking shovel. It's not particularly special and it's not magical or anything, it's just a shovel, and the best part about it is that you need to charge it up for an attack. Ultimately, I mentioned the shop in these items because limiting how useful these items are makes it so that it doesn't disrupt the rest of the game too much. Now that we've gone over how players can be isolated even on the ship, let's talk about why this matters in the first place. I mean, it's supposed to be the safest place in the game, right? What could possibly happen that would make it worth trying to make horror more effective in a place where there is no horror? Well, probably something like this. As you probably realized by now, either because you've already played this game or because I mentioned it like 8 times by now, the moons of Lethal Company aren't exactly the safest places because they can quickly go from being relatively safe to being the streets of New York after dark. Unsurprisingly, as time passes and the night sky spills like ink across the horizon, the moons become a lot more dangerous, but time passing is not really noticeable when you're inside the factory being chased by 4 different entities like you're playing Risk of Rain 2. Of course, you can always keep a pretty good estimate in your head, but it's never exact, and there's always the looming threat of being fired by your employees for not filling the quoted time, so as you keep playing, it's not uncommon for you to accidentally lose track of time. Anyways, before we get into the fun part about the entities, I want to talk about why the moons being terrifying themselves matters, because the terror that is felt from each of the entities and the environment they're presented in naturally have a strong correspondence because of how they enhance each other. When you add isolation into this feedback loop, the terror gets even stronger. To understand what I mean, let me ask you a question. If you were walking home at night, would you be unsettled by the thought of potentially getting robbed and shot, or are you unsettled by being in a place that's not exactly the safest at night? Well, it doesn't really matter how you answer, because I already answered this question at the beginning of the video, and if you remember, consider yourself special, because I definitely forgot. The moons themselves are not initially threatening, but as time passes and the moons simultaneously become more unnavigable and entities become more likely to appear, that's when they start getting interesting. But there's kind of a problem with this when it comes to Lethal Company because of multiplayer. Any place can be intimidating when you're alone, but Lethal Company is built on multiplayer, and when you're in a place with your friends, the tone of the atmosphere is generally too positive for you to be intimidated by your surroundings. That's where isolation comes into play, because it takes that away long enough for you to be affected by the entities and the environment. For example, imagine you are playing as Ship Guy, and you see on the monitors that all of your friends are dead, but they left enough scrap, barely enough to meet the quota. You will absolutely lose the run if you don't get to it in time, so with no other options, you decide to make the trek as your friends watch you post-mortem, unable to give you any reassuring words. This situation is nerve-wracking for a lot of reasons, because you have people depending on you and the stakes are already high. On top of that, you're alone. This is when moons become terrifying. In this scenario, you have to be cautious because one mistake could lose you everything, and in that moment there is no one to distract you from the scenario because you're already isolated. As the moon gets darker, obstacles blocking your path aren't that reliable as pathfinding devices, so you have to retrace your steps. As you pick up any items, you're also weighed down by them, so making your way back isn't necessarily going to feel the same either, which is only more disorienting. On top of making your way to the items fairly late, you'll have to make the trek back even later with more entities crawling around. As the moon gets even darker, unsure of where to go, completely alone, and with the looming threat of entities everywhere, that's when the moons really become terrifying. Granted, this scenario is pretty specific, but the point is that as players spend more time isolated on the moons, the more terror they experience as the more dangerous their scenario becomes. Some moons have their own designs that can affect what they do to a player, so let's briefly go over each of the moons to see how they synergize with isolation. Oh, by the way, I know that the company cruiser might seem like it makes the moons a lot less threatening, but not necessarily, because it's actually kind of bad. It's so bad that people have apparently found it more useful as extra storage than as an actual truck. Okay, now let's actually go over each of the moons. To make things easier to keep track of, let's group the moons based on visual similarities and only consider the moons that are available from the start of the game. First are the desert moons. You have experimentation, assurance, and offense. Then there are the forest moons of Adamant's Vow and March. These are followed by the Dead Star moons, Rend and Dine, and then finally is Titan, which is probably the most unique one. For convenience's sake, let's go over the desert moons and then continue down the line. We've already gone over the description of experimentation, but to keep things short, it doesn't really do much to intimidate players because the route from the ship to the factory is so direct. Even when considering the natural layer of dust and fog that shrouds this barren shell of a planet, it's still not enough to pose a threat because you can just spam the scanner in order to find your way back. The only weather that would make experimentation on its own terrifying would probably be an eclipse, but we'll also save that for later because it makes more sense once we go over how eyeless dogs interact under isolation. For now, just keep in mind that eclipses basically make every moon extremely dangerous by keeping them in a state of night for the entire day. Next up on the desert moons is Assurance, and it's basically the exact same as experimentation with two key differences. First is the fact that it has slightly more obstacles in the form of large geological formations, and second is the fact that the path to the factory is not a straight line, now requiring you to twist your way around various obstacles. Assurance also isn't the most dangerous moon because the path is still pretty simple to memorize, but the fact that it's no longer as simple does make it possible for players to get lost as the day comes to a close. Unless you're like me, who has the memory of a goldfish. Probably the same reason I keep forgetting to upload, huh? Now for offense. Offense has all the same stuff as Assurance because canonically speaking, offense is Assurance. Well, at least it was. In fact, offense is just a chunk of Assurance that was ripped out of itself and then thrown into orbit. It has similar geological structures and the same risks of getting lost due to its more complex path and increased number of obstacles. Assurance and Offense are the first moons that I would consider actually capable of being able to terrify your players based on how their environments can hide enemies behind corners, as well as being able to block communication since the proximity chat gets cut off by said obstacles. It's more of a risk as night approaches, but it still makes it possible to lose yourself when being careless, and the anxiety that you can feel from that is pretty impressive considering how some horror games will resort to trying to rupture your eardrums in order to scare you. I will mention though, although it's not that unique in-game, Offense is my squad's go-to moon in the early game, since the other moons don't have enough scrap or are too bothersome. By bothersome, I actually mean the forest moons because that's when they become interesting. You know, originally I wanted to use an analogy where I compared walking alone in a park, but I decided to cut it because that's what the forest moons are. I'm gonna go over Vow now because I want to keep the trend of going from easier to harder moons consistent. If you look at it from a map, you would probably think that it's just as simple as experimentation because it has the same straightforward line. Not necessarily. The problem with Vow is not just the route, it's hills and how the forest makes it a lot harder to see. The hills on this moon can actually cause significant changes in elevation, just high and low enough for it to obscure your vision. Additionally, the straight path makes you walk across a bridge that will make any architect faint from how ugly it is and make any engineer smile at how it's managed to hold itself up after all these years. There are actually equations that describe how the bridge works, which I'm sure we all know off the top of our heads, but basically, the giants that I wanted to talk about later can make them degrade in durability if they stand on the bridge for too long, and players can also cause their bridge to collapse if they do the same thing. Along with just having players hesitate whenever they look at the bridge, they're also forced to use it one person at a time because of how it'll collapse if multiple players try to race across it. They'll either take the side bridges or just wait, resulting in players being split up. Specifically, they're more prone to splitting up when bringing scrap back to the ship. This is how players can get lost on this moon because they end up slightly deviating from their original path, and because of how the forest and hill structure isn't the most distinguishable, it can result in a situation where a lost player has to run around in the dark woods, fearful that something is going to come along and eat them. Now think about everything Vow does and double it and give it to the next moon, because that's exactly what playing on March feels like. Seriously, I would call it annoying, but March has probably given me the most trouble because of how much more dangerous it is. It's under constant rain, so there's always the possibility of accidentally getting sucked in by quicksand on accident. Its fire exits are more spread out than paranoid Minecraft players on an SMP are, and it has lakes that you can accidentally slip into and drown in instantly if you aren't careful. Oh, also, the lake is in front of the ship, so you could either make your way around it, or you could be like me and be so tired of playing on this damn moon that you would rather throw yourself into the lake and get eaten by piranhas and die than have to play on it for even a minute longer. Finally is Adamance. Adamance is like what happens when you take Vow and March and you blend them together after adding in a few million years of erosion to the mix. I want to stop talking about these moons now, so to wrap things up, what the forest moons add to the fear factor is uncomfortable terrain and even more obstacles and trees, resulting in a more unfriendly environment. We're getting close to the end, so hang in with me because Lord knows I'm barely holding on as well. Second to last is Rend and Dine, so basically anybody else besides me will call these moons snowy moons, and as you'll know because you're such a good listener, that's not what I call them. These moons are part of a white dwarf system, and as a few of you will know, a white dwarf is the corpse of a dead star. Because of this, I'm gonna call them Dead Star moons instead, because it sounds cooler, and if anyone else came up with this name before me, it warms my heart to know that there's at least one other person who's as insane as I am. Names aside, Rend and Dine are pretty similar with one distinct difference that we'll get into shortly. These moons build on the previous moon's developments with more difficult terrain and winding complex paths, but they go all in terms of atmosphere. Because they're part of a dead star system, it's always dark and always snowy on both moons, so you would think that these two moons would be the most terrifying we talk about just based on principle, but this is only true for Dine. Rend actually has a lifeline in the form of a string of lights that leads you to and from the factory, so it's hard to stray from the path when the path is literally the only thing that you can see. Dine, on the other hand, is absolutely more terrifying because there are no lights, so it's basically like playing in a constant state of night. The darkness coupled with the permanent blizzard is the perfect environment for isolation because it makes it harder to see both friends and enemies, as well as dulling your sense of hearing. The general result is that your awareness is limited to a bubble of your immediate surroundings because as soon as you hear anything that doesn't sound like a person, it's time to start running. Outside entities are also likely to spawn, so let's finally talk about them before we can wrap this video up and I can finally go to sleep. If we're being real, I think that the exterior entities of Lethal Company are probably the best horror monsters that I've ever had the honor of dealing with because of how natural they feel. Instead of overly relying on visuals or trying to smash your eardrums, they're actually designed to work with a lot of the other parts of the game, which is why I made the decision to go through the structure of these moons before talking about the entities because of how well they synergize with the moons. The moons are basically like gas tanks. They have all the right ingredients of being unsettling and unfamiliar, but the entities act like the spark that gets the engine moving because they're the only real consistent source of danger. Of course there are environmental hazards, but those pale in comparison to what those hazards are hiding, including packs of giant dogs that your friend would probably adopt and call harmless whenever you visit them. Dangerous friends aside, this monstrosity is the eyeless dog. It's the first one that we're going to talk about because the first time I saw one of these things in the wild, I yelled for help and it immediately ran over to me and swallowed me whole because even though eyeless dogs are blind, they have incredible hearing. So good in fact that if your microphone is too close to your face, they can pick up on your breathing. Obviously, you don't want to talk and accidentally give your position away to these things, so you have to rely on the chat if you want to communicate, and when you have to shuffle around in order to accidentally avoid touching them or letting them smell you, it's a little difficult to stay calm enough to type under pressure, because if they accidentally graze you, or even worse, if they hear your loud mechanical keyboard, it's basically over for you. By preventing you from talking to your teammates, it makes communication much more difficult, especially because of how you'll usually encounter more than one eyeless dog at a time. As we've already discussed, an absence of communication is a key part of isolating someone, so that kind of effect is emulated even if players aren't physically alone because it makes them direct their attention on the horror and not other players. In moments like these, players also have to take responsibility for themselves, and that breaks the group mentality because it gets players to act independently. These giant canines are actually prime examples of how entities use their surroundings because even though they're pretty big, they can still sneak up on you because of your limited knowledge of the surrounding moons. Isolation makes this more effective because, as we mentioned earlier, less people means less area covered, and with obstacles blocking the scanner, they can pretty easily catch you around corners. I feel like the eyeless dogs benefit more from using isolation than they actually contribute to it, and that's totally fine. In fact, that's probably the better alternative because Lethal Company isn't a psychological horror, so it's good that the build-up from the isolation is actually being capitalized on. This is also true for the things inside and the last two that we'll be talking about. One of these two is the Kidnapper Fox, and its entire purpose is to drag players away from their friends to a lonely death. I don't think I need to say anything else, so let's move on. On your way back to the ship, you can run into this amalgam called the Forest Keeper. The Forest Keeper is the counterpart of the eyeless dogs, in the sense that it detects you using its many eyes. They crawl out of the ground and usually act alone, although two or more can rarely appear. It's much larger than you physically, but can move faster than you can walk, and are especially faster when you run into them as you're hauling scrap back to the ship. The giant will initially just look at you for a few moments before racing at you. If it catches you, it'll pick you up like a toy and not just eat you, but amalgamate you into itself. The only way to save yourself in this case is to trigger its eyesight by using a flashbang. I think that the Forest Keepers by themselves are already pretty scary based on the premise alone, but isolation makes them way more effective. The giant only follows one person or moving target at a time, so if you and your pals play your cards right, you can take turns drawing its attention or sacrifice someone so the rest of you can get away. When you're isolated, you understand that that's not an option, so your only course of action is to run and hide. To basically recap everything, entities on the outside are really good at capitalizing on their environments in isolation, which leaves an authentic feeling of sheer dread whenever you encounter one of these things. Anyways, it's time for closing thoughts, and I'm personally very excited for this section because that means you made it all the way to the end. The way isolation works in Lethal Company has always been impressive to me because of how effective it actually is. When I first played the game, I didn't expect much, but the way it's able to terrify me with isolation was actually surprising because I never thought that a multiplayer game could get that reaction out of me. If you haven't played it yet, I would definitely recommend picking it up. Someone else has already made a video on why you should buy it, but my argument is that Lethal Company is one of the rare games with a developer that's actually trying to make a good game and not just rush into building a brand to drain your money. The lore and storytelling is exquisite, the gameplay is even better, and you can go through it with your pals! Thank you for watching. Last time I gave everybody who stayed until the end a virtual cookie, but this time I'm gonna give everyone matcha flavored ice cream instead, because it has a nice and refined taste. If you don't like it, here's a 17-inch pizza instead. To my 6,000-ish subscribers, I'm not gonna vanish for 8 months again without any contact, and this time it's a promise. Oh, one last thing. If you really like this video, consider joining as a channel member. It supports me, and it's also great motivation to work faster. With that being said, thank you for watching again, and maybe I'll see you again next time.